Hi, welcome to Lesson 2 in the online Modern Harmony course. Today's lesson is going to be about modes and scales and also about tonality. So, what is a mode? Well, a mode is a group of notes arranged in a scale from which a piece or a part of piece is going to be constructed. A mode really is a way of selecting and limiting the character of the melodic and harmonic material. Anytime you want to create character, what you don't want is all kinds of things happening that have no relation to each other. So, in fact, all of the lessons, including this one, are really about ways to create a certain sound in the music. A mode is one way. Last week we talked about various kinds of dissonance treatment and so on. Anyway, a mode is a way to give you a very focused character to a piece or to a part of a piece. Like I said, a mode is a scale, a group of notes lined up in a scale. A mode can be made up of equal intervals or unequal intervals. Equal intervals, where all the steps are the same, like for example the chromatic scale, are rather boring because everything's the same. Here's the whole tone scale. Example 1. As we can hear, since every interval here is a whole tone, that's why it's called the whole tone scale, the result is that it doesn't have any particular gravity. I could stop on any note and it wouldn't feel more or less final than any other note. There's no sense that one note needs to go to the next one because all the intervals are equal. There's no gravitation, if we can put it that way. If we have a mode with unequal intervals, that changes. Let's look at this exotic mode, which has varied intervals. Example 2. As we can hear, this mode starts off with a semitone, then a whole tone, then a semitone, a whole tone, a whole tone, a whole tone, and a whole tone. So, although there are a lot of whole tones here, there are still 2 semitones. That's enough to ensure that the mode isn't just homogeneous all the time. There's a general principle about musical intervals, which is that smaller intervals attract each other. Like a semitone is more attractive, shall we say, than a whole tone. So if I look at this, the first 3 notes, in those first 3 notes, there's more attraction between the first 2, because those make a semitone, than between the second and third notes. All of them can be used, but there'll be more of a sense of cadence or arriving at a specific place when I focus on those semitones. Okay, so we're going to start by talking about the family of traditional Western modes. Sometimes they're called the church modes, the traditional diatonic modes. Okay? And then later on, we'll talk about rather more exotic modes. But the principles and the ways of looking at them are pretty much the same. One thing to realize is that if we start with these Western modes, commonly known as the church modes, actually they're related to each other. If you look at example 3, in example 3, you'll see I have 7 different modes, but they're really all just the same mode starting on a different note. So if I start on a different note, the sequence of intervals won't be the same. For example, the first one, Ionian, which everybody recognizes as a major scale, has the same notes as Dorian, but it just starts and ends on D instead of on C. And as a result, the semitones are not in the same places in the scale. In a major scale, the semitones are between the 3rd and 4th degrees and 7 and 8, which gives us the leading tone. Again, we see that principle of attraction between semitones in operation. In the Dorian one, however, the semitone is between the 2nd and 3rd degrees, and then the 6th and 7th. We don't have a leading tone in the Dorian mode, and as we shall see, that creates a certain difference in the sound. The third one in the example, the Phrygian, same thing starting on E. Now we have the semitone right at the beginning, and then between the 5th and the 6th degrees of the scale. So the placement of those semitones is going to be important in creating the flavor of each one. But what I wanted to point out is, since all these modes can be derived from the first one, the C major one, in effect we're talking about a family of modes. That means all these modes have certain things in common. For example, if I wanted to modulate from C Ionian to D Dorian, it's all the same pitches. I don't have to change any accidentals at all. Okay, that means that it's much easier to use various modes in the same piece without transposing them, if that's what we want. Of course, we can transpose them, and sometimes we will, but it's important to realize that as a family of modes, I really have quite a lot of variety in what I can get out of just the same 7 notes. Okay, the same 7 notes in the scale. Okay, so you can look at the other modes in example 3. I've just talked about the first 3. The others will also be in the PDF, and the link to the PDF will be under the video. Now let's talk about that a little bit more. I said that the modal color comes from the interval content. And like I said before, the most interesting modes come from varied interval structures, the ones that aren't all the same. The first mode which you looked at, Ionian, is pretty much the same as the major scale. Because if they have this kind of interval variety, we can use them for fairly long stretches. One problem with the whole tone scale, which we saw in example 1, it gets boring after a while because it's always the same notes and there's never any variety of intervals. Whereas if with the Dorian or Phrygian or any of these common scales, the Gregorian modes, we have enough variety that we can vary the harmony quite a bit. Okay, and because we can vary the harmony, that means, and because of the interval contrast, they also create direction. If you listen to the Phrygian mode again, now if I go down, there's a definite feeling that the F going to the E is close enough to give a feeling like somehow the E is inevitable afterward. And we'll see when I add chords to that, gets even clearer. So again, that gives a specific interval character to the Phrygian mode. In the Dorian mode, on the other hand, those intervals, the semitones, are not in the same place. So it's the fact that there is no leading tone in the Dorian mode at either end, neither above the tonic nor below it, that gives the Dorian a sort of a more floating quality. When you examine a diatonic mode, if you want to really understand the character of the mode, the first thing to look at is the placement of the semitones. And as I said before, that relates to what I call the leading tone principle. Semitones create tonal attraction, so you can use those semitones to create a sense that one note is more strongly attracted to the next one. Now let's watch what happens when we build triads on each step of the mode. Example 4 is the Lydian mode. Here it is. But now I'm building triads on each step. Here's example 4. Now, the things which stick out about the Lydian mode, especially since we're quite used to major, so we compare it to major, it has a semitone at the end, but that semitone makes a minor triad if I make a triad on top of it. So the Lydian mode can be characterized as like a minor 7th degree going to a major tonic. In the same way, if I go from the 2nd degree to the tonic, it's major to major. So that gives this mode, again, a special character. That's the particular character of Lydian. Once you add the full triad above each note in the mode, you will realize very quickly that it takes only 2 or 3 chords to hear all the notes of the mode. Since a triad makes 3 notes sound at the same time, you get all the notes in the mode very fast. In other words, for the listener, the modal color is established almost immediately with chords like that. And that makes it even stronger. So you try out the triads on each step of the mode. You remark where is the diminished triad. In these diatonic modes, there's always one place where you have a diminished triad. In the Lydian, it's on the 4th degree. 1, 2, 3, 4, diminished triad. Since the diminished triad is unstable, we can't stop on it by itself. It has to go somewhere else. So that also creates a certain sense of direction. In tonal music, the leading tone triad is the one that does that, and that explains part of the reason that the cadence is so powerful. The tritone in that diminished triad resolves into the 3rd of the tonic. Okay, now I want to look at something else. I want to look at, as I said before, all these diatonic modes are part of the same family. We're going to try a little experiment. When I showed them to you in example 4, I just took each mode as starting on one scale step of the white notes of the piano. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the same modes, but I'm going to transpose them all into C. If you look at example 5, you will see that I have all the modes lined up, but I have them lined up going from sharps into more and more flats. I'm going to play the whole series. These are the chords. And you're going to notice how the color changes as I go down the list. I'm starting with Lydian because that's the sharpest of all of them, because it has the sharp fourth degree. And I'm going to end up with the Locrian, which is the flattest of the whole lot, because the tonic triad is diminished. So I'm going to play the list and just notice the difference in character between each one. So first, Lydian. Now Ionian, which is the same as major. So what's changed is I don't have the F sharp anymore. Now I add one flat, the B flat. This gives me Mixolydian. Okay, second flat. Now it's Dorian. One more flat, Aeolian, which is like the natural minor scale. Phrygian now, 4 flats. And finally, Locrian with 5 flats. As you can hear, and as we see in the example, the lower I go, the more flats I have, the darker the sound of the mode. Just a general change of character. Just to quickly compare, I'm just going to play the first and last one so you listen to them side by side. Again, Lydian. Locrian. As you can see, there's quite a big difference in the harmonic character of those two modes. So that's something to keep in mind. If you're using modes, and you don't even have to do this with the traditional modes, if you make a family of modes, we're starting the same notes but on different degrees of the scale, you should also create a chart like this and be able to work with them as a variety of colors. I'm calling it bright or dark. You can call them what you want, but there's a definite continuum there. Okay, so now you've chosen a mode. We want to write a piece or a passage with it. How do you create the modal flavor and the harmony? Well, once you've made your list of triads, like I just showed, okay, the thing to do is exploit the most characteristic intervals of the mode in question. With these church modes, usually what we do is you compare them to major and minor, because that's what everybody's familiar with, and the differences are what we exploit. So for example, Dorian is not too far from D minor. However, it has no leading tone, and that's what's going to give Dorian its particular flavor. So even if I do what we'll call dominant to tonic, the chord on the A minor followed by the D, it doesn't have the kind of drive that the D minor has with its C sharp. So that's the kind of thing you would emphasize if you want to make sure that the listener really notices the Dorian flavor. Let's listen to example 6A. And then, actually there are two example 6As, and then 6B. 6A, the two examples are both examples of Dorian mode. Example 6A. So as we can hear, both of these little phrases sound like Dorian. Why? Well, if you look at the first one, starts on the D, goes to F, then a G chord, and then an A chord but with C natural. So the cadence is A minor chord to D minor chord, and that's what gives it the modal sound. If you look at the second example, you'll notice that the chord before the end is a G7 chord. So the cadence goes. Well, since one of the typical features of Dorian is the raised 6th degree, that's what I've chosen to put before the cadence. So both these little examples show how you could give the piece a Dorian flavor, specifically with the cadences. In other words, the important part of the phrase is used to underline a sonority that's typical of the mode. Okay, it's important to make the tonic clear because since I'm using the same chords in these phrases that I could be using in C major, watch what happens if I change the rhythm. All it takes is one change at the end, and now I have a cadence in C major. Okay, that's because I stopped on the G chord and then moved to a C chord, so it sounds like a 5-1. Here, you can hear that that G major chord is just a little neighbor note going along to the A minor chord, so it emphasizes the Dorian flavor. It's really important to understand that the modal flavor is not just an issue of what notes you're choosing. It's also how you set up the rhythm and how the phrase moves in general. If the motives and the rhythm of the phrase don't emphasize the notes that are typical of the mode, you won't get much sense of it, even if on paper it looks right. So it's important that on the rhythmic arrival points, and specifically at the cadence, that we hear things that are typical of the mode in question. Okay, so as I said, we can make the tonic clear, first of all, just by repeating it, by making the chord at the beginning and the end, the tonic chord. The modal cadence, try and arrange that the chord before the end contains the characteristic note of the mode. For example, if I wanted to write something in Phrygian mode, since the characteristic of Phrygian mode is that semitone between the tonic and the second degree, I try and have some kind of harmony that would go like, so you can hear that semitone in the bass. And that gives me the Phrygian quality. Okay, and you try, of course, to put those chords in a relationship, rhythmic relationship, that sounds like tension going to release. The tension is the chord before the cadence. You can call it the dominant equivalent if you want, the same thing that a dominant does in tonal harmony, and the last chord is the tonic. Okay, so as I said, the dominant equivalent for modes usually is taken by a chord or chords which emphasize the characteristic tones. Again, you put these chords on an upbeat rhythm and you have them going to a tonic, and if the voice leading is smooth, you're going to get a sense that you're leading to the tonic. Unlike tonal music, in modal music, root movement by fifths is not necessarily the norm. In fact, root movement by fifths has a kind of a tendency to almost make it sound too tonal. Listen to this. You really want at the end of that, because those fifths in the bass tend to want to continue. More common would be to have, let's say, root movements by thirds, as in the example 6A. First was a D minor chord, then an F major chord, then a G major chord, a second relationship, then A minor, another second relationship, and there's a fifth relation at the end. Now let's do the same thing with an example of Lydian mode. Example 6B. We can see in 6B that the specific character of the Lydian mode comes from the raised fourth degree. Since the key signature here is 3 flats, which looks like E flat major, by having an A natural, that's how I get that flavor. And in fact, if you look at the cadence, let's compare that with what it would be if it was in E flat major. In E flat major, I would have done this. Clear 5-1. Compare again. By using a 2 chord before the final tonic, that allows me to get that sharp 4 in there, that A natural in this case, and that gives me the Lydian character. So again, that's a way of making the mode sound Lydian, making the passage sound Lydian. Notice also at the beginning, although my bass goes, unlike in tonal harmony where I would have done 1, 5, 1, here I'm doing a third relationship. I'm going to a G minor chord. Then when I do use the 5, it's a short duration going on to a 6, and then the 6 goes to the 2 and the 1. Well, that's not a typical tonal cadence, but it is a typical Lydian cadence. One thing that's particularly important, you have to pay attention to situations where you do have a tritone. For example, in the Lydian mode, or the Lydian example I just played, There is a tritone between A natural and E flat. Let's try something. I'm going to change the second of last chord so that the top note is E flat. As soon as I do that, there's a very strong sense that it wants to go to B flat major. That's because the tritone has a strong need to resolve. So you have to be very careful about tritones, or they will sound like seventh chords or dominant sevens, because they can quickly steer you away from the modal color. One particular case that's a bit unusual is the Locrian mode, because we mentioned in the Locrian mode that the tonic triad is a diminished chord. Because it's a diminished chord, it's not going to sound final by itself. The solution to that is simple. Just leave out the fifth. So when you make your Locrian cadence, let's say, instead of going, if I include that note, it sounds unstable, but if I go, or, and then I've got the Locrian effect like that.